So we'll move straight on with Dániel Komáromy and Lóránt Szabó. Thank you. Okay, guys.
All right. Great. Let's set this up real quick. All right. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Dániel Komáromy. I'm head of research at Task Security Labs. With my colleague Lóránt today, we'll be talking about pawning Huawei basebands. So this presentation will be split into 3 chapters, and with each chapter, we try to highlight a takeaway that we feel represents our journey through this research. The first one being that Android phones can be looked at as something more than just containers for running apps, and you should threat model their attack vectors accordingly. The second is that bug hunting or vulnerability development is very rarely a straight line from start to finish. And then the third takeaway for us is that low-level security can often be about very different things than just typical more parser code that just happens to be running in a slightly different context. So with that, let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is why we actually picked Huawei devices as our research target. And the answer to that is basically in the name of the platform. Kirin, the chipset family name that Huawei uses, meaning unicorn. So basically a friendly, fluffy target. At least that's what we thought going into this work, but more on that later. So why would you consider Huawei devices and Huawei basebands in particular friendly targets? Well, the answer is twofold. One is it's been researched before. And the guys from Tencent did a great talk a few years ago at Black Hat. And also the other part of the equation is that it's a very well-known fact that at this point a somewhat old but still a relevant version of the modem source code has leaked online and is still available. And of course there's the fact that Androids are usually more debug-friendly devices. They can be rooted and so on. And in particular, from prior research, it was known, or it was understood to be the case rather, that the modem itself, in the case of Huawei Kirin's, is fairly debug-friendly, meaning that there are readily available interfaces from the Android side once you root the device to directly peek and poke the modem memory. So that sounded like a good place to start. But nonetheless, we wanted to still find something as a target within the baseband which would be interesting or novel in a way. And our definition for that was, first of all, to find an aspect of the protocol stack which would not be part of the leak, so as not to be so boring that we only look at source code. And more importantly, we wanted to find a focus area which has not been what most of the previously published memory safety type 0 days have focused on in this area, which would be information element TLV parsing type bugs in the NAS layer. So when I say NAS layer, a bit of introduction here to 3GPP protocols and to the concept of NAS versus AS. The first being the non-access stratum, and then AS, the access stratum. So what does that mean? Basically, the non-access stratum means the protocol that's essentially a logical link between the endpoints within the operator's network and the actual user device. And these are the protocols that implement the things that you would think of first when you think about basebands or cellular communications. So call control, mobility management, meaning identifying where the subscribers are in the network, texts, and so on. But again, these are logical endpoints. Below this layer is the actual access stratum, which is the literal final link. So that's the actual wireless layer. And accordingly, the protocols in that stack are there to actually manage the wireless links, to actually manage the radio channels, and so on. And so for us, we decided to focus within this area of the access stratum within the baseband stack. And the reason for that was that what I've mentioned before, actually the leak that exists is only for the NAS code of Huawei. So the access stratum code doesn't exist in a source code leak, which was good. And the other thing that was good is, as you see on the slide, another thing mentioned about a good target is that we wanted a protocol family where the implementation is more agnostic to the fact that, again, known from prior research, Huawei, one of the security defenses that their baseband employs is that they only use a safe version of memcopy, which is essentially a compiler hardening that will pretty much automatically eliminate most of the typical first order didn't check the length, even though destination is a fixed size buffer on the stack. This kind of memcopy buffer overflows are automatically coded out. And so what that meant for us is that we wanted something where the protocol itself doesn't lend itself at all to using memcopy for marshalling. And we found that within the AS layer in something called RRM, which stands for Radio Resource Management, which is a fairly complex protocol, especially because even though it was originally done or envisioned for 2G, over the years it got a lot of extra revisions, 3G, 4G, and so on. But more importantly for us is the way that encoding within the RRM layer works, which is a bit-based encoding. And this is where we get introduced to something called CSN1, or Concrete Syntax Notation 1. So for those unfamiliar with it, it's actually very similar, well, in many ways similar to ASN1, which is a more well-known, more widespread used protocol. The difference is really in that first letter. So whereas in ASN, the A stands for abstract, obviously the C here stands for concrete. And the difference is that is exactly like the name suggests, where ASN1 was envisioned to be able to be a descriptor language for all kinds of protocols, and obviously you see that reflected in the fact that it's used in all kinds of domains. CSN1 was created very specifically within 3GPP to this narrow area of, okay, let's use this for a bit encoding for RRM. And accordingly, the language itself, the syntax is very, very simple. It has basically bit conditionals and then bit length fields, and everything beyond that is already baked into the specificities of the types of messages and fields that you have. So you don't have any abstract notions of objects or enumerations or anything like this. All the types or fields of messages are already going to be very specific to particular 3GPP messages. Here on the slide, you can see two 3GPP documents. I would hope that the talk maybe inspires you to want to look more into this area. Then those would be the good documents to start at if you're so inclined to read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages, of course, but that's how it is in baseband security always. And so what was interesting for us in CS? And the answer is that, well, the name is deceiving because it's in the end not so concrete after all. Which is to say, when I say that it's a very simplistic protocol, it still leaves some room for some dynamically interpreted message formats. Namely, there are various ways to have still variable length elements. The syntax knows two versions of this. There's explicitly and implicitly set length elements. The explicit is not so interesting for us for the presentation. We're going to focus on this idea of implicit variable length. And if you look at the slide, the second picture where you see that **1 notation highlighted, this is the idea of the implicit length in CSN1. That basically the spec is not going to say what would be the max value of how many you're supposed to have, or it's not going to define it in a separate field which would be the length value or the iteration value, but it has this recursive format. That essentially, that **1, what that means is when you're decoding the message, you have to start parsing bit by bit, and if you see a 1 bit, then that means there's going to be one more enumeration of whatever you're iterating, and then you check again. It's a 1 bit, then you go again and again. So recursively until you get 1 bit. There's obviously also the other way around in the spec where the 0 is for repetition, but it doesn't matter much. What matters a whole lot more is, well, if you have this kind of syntax, then somewhere in the spec you would assume that there would have to be still the definition of length constraints, at least if you wanted some version of memory safety, obviously. But this is where CSN1 diverges most importantly from a security perspective from ASN1. Because whereas in ASN1 and also in higher level parts of 3GPP stacks like the TLV syntax, there are no constraints, there's no notion of length constraints in the grammar at all. And what that means is if you look at the complete CSN1 definition for these particular messages, nowhere anywhere does it say anything about this particular field, well, how many repetitions should this have maximum? And then the only thing you're left with is, of course, 3GPP definitions are not all machine-readable grammar definitions, like you imagine an ASM1 grammar definition. A lot of it is just free-flowing text. And so this is the point where you can hope that a careful parsing of the document for the implementer would have sentences like the one highlighted on the slide, where there's like a throwaway line that says, oh, by the way, and here the repetitions shouldn't be more than X, Y, Z. The unfortunate, or depending on your point of view, the fortunate fact was, however, that actually took us a lot of effort to at least find, one slide like this that we can put up, which is to say, for the vast majority of these types of structures and fields, there's nothing like this. Not only in the grammar definitions, but just not in the text either. So just nowhere anywhere does the 3GPP spec say how many repetitions should you have maximum for a given thing. And of course, at this point, we get that magic line of implementation defined, right? Or left up to the implementer. And as we know, for those looking for security bugs, it's usually a very good place to start. And so that's obviously what we did at this point. We wanted to start looking at Huawei's particular implementation. Because remember, right now, you don't have any bugs. You certainly don't have any security bugs. You have a notion of a type of bug pattern that you're hoping to be looking for. But to understand whether in practice also Huawei actually employed an implementation that didn't really worry about the number of recursions, we had to understand how they implemented the CSN1 decoding. Here we don't have time to dwell too much into the details. It's a fairly complex two-stage implementation where the first stage is a virtual machine. So at this point you fire up your Gidja and spend some time understanding the binary packed format of the peculiar virtual machine that Huawei implemented. And long story short, after a while, we wrote our own decompiler of their binary codes of these little programs where each program represents the decoding of a message. And you end up something like what you see in the slide, which, well, at first it might look foreign, but if you stare at it enough, it starts to make sort of human-readable sense. The most important thing that was the takeaway for us was that this first stage, which is the VM decoding, doesn't actually do any copying at all. It's more just a way to identify and tag the fields. So at this stage, obviously, the most important finding was that during this tagging, there's no facility at all to limit the number of recursions. It will just faithfully record how many there were. But of course, there's also no copying, so there would be no corruption yet. But then the second stage of the code turned out to be more typical linear code, so that was more trivial to understand. And we found both of the things that we were hoping for to find. One is that once you get to the code that, based on the tagging, actually does the copying, the for loops are not going to be limited by anything other than how many recursions the wire format suggested. So there was no security checks here for whether compared to what you're decoding into, which are always, in the case of Huawei, one big union, so fixed size structures, fixed size the various arrays for the various different message fields. And then the other thing that we found, which was what we expected going in, is that since it's a bit-based encoding, it shouldn't be using memcopy for the copying, and that turned out to be the case, that indeed that they have their own obviously simple, nothing special to write home about, a bit copying function. The thing that was important about it was that it was not memcopy, which means that the compiler-based hardening that would automatically turn it into something else obviously didn't touch this API. So in a way, the practical end result is that you're using essentially a naked memcopy for unbound copies. And so at this point, we could say, oh, infinite bugs. And when I say infinite, given that literally every single case where there's a repetition would have this problem, it really meant hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of instances. But of course, the important part to see here is that still at this point, these are you don't necessarily characterize them as vulnerability primitives, let alone something that you would say is reasonably exploitable. Obviously, bugs are bugs, but whether that can be leveraged well enough depends on a number of factors. And here it's worth time to take a pause and just sort of summarize some of the disadvantages and advantages of deciding on this attack vector or this attack surface of this repeated bit encoding in CSN. Obviously, some of the drawbacks is that, well, the bit encoding itself, because when you're copying bits, that's going to mean that even if you find an instance where you end up overflowing, you might not necessarily be able to control entire byte values. A lot of these copies work in a way where you have a repetition of, you take 3 bits and write that into a byte value. So obviously when you will get to, you want to overwrite particular things, pointers or what have you, this kind of limitation can be, and in many cases, what's the difference between a bug or something that's actually well suited for practical exploitation. And the other thing that's important to point out is that being obviously in the lower layer of the stack, the messages here are still very small in size. Some radio resource management messages are large enough, hundreds of bytes, that you can take better advantage of them to create exploitable vulnerability primitives, but quite a lot of them where this bug shows up are things like SI system information frames, which are very small. They are going to be somewhere between 19 and 23 bytes, depending on the type of the system information frame. So obviously, in this case, many of these hundreds of instances actually run into the limit that, okay, in theory, we have infinite repetition, but obviously you are practically limited by the number of bits that you can literally send in. And so this was the point where you get like not the fun part of vulnerability development, but the grind part, right? And there's not sort of like a silver bullet to it. It was just, kind of going through the instances manually and analyzing them and, almost good, almost good, almost good. And Lori did most of that painstaking work, so credit to him. The important result is in the end, we did end up with a couple instances that turned out to be actually very solid vulnerability primitives that would lend themselves well to like a proper exploitation. As you can see on the slide, some of these CVEs. So in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about a single one, which is a stack buffer overflow that we managed to find, or you could argue that we managed to create based on one of these bugs. I'm just going to sort of glance through this, more just to give you an idea of how we worked. We're going to go inside out, or middle out, I should say. So we're going to start at the final destination of where, after all the marshalling and the CSN decoding, some copying that actually ends up being a stack overflow happens. So if you see the highlighted parts of the function on the right, you can see that we kind of end up in a fairly textbook situation. At this point, don't worry about where use bits comes from. Just assume that, well, you can see it's an integer value, and if you assume that maybe you would be able to control that value, then you can see that the check that happens does a cast, so it's like a textbook integer wrap that makes the length check useless, and then you end up in a pretty much trivial for loop buffer overflow. But of course here the question is, okay, that's great, but do I get to actually control use bits? So then you go one step out and you look at the particular 3GPP spec to see where that field comes from. And then first we found that actually that is not one of these repetitive style fields. That would be a fixed field. So the values of that would always have to be within range. But within that same message, there were other fields that would have this repetitive format. And so the idea shows itself that, okay, well, what you can do is you use the corruption in the repetitive part of the message to corrupt from the one field to the other within the decoded structure, and then this way you conjure up actually in the end an invalid use bits where you control all the 4 bytes. But of course, that's just a theory when you look at like, okay, there are all these different fields, but then you again have to take one more step and look at, okay, well, what does the output structure look like? In what order are the fields? Obviously, if the one you want to overflow from is not in the right sequential order, then, then again, you get nowhere. And here again, we were lucky because, as it turns out, it was the case that the field that we were interested in, even though you could look at this and see that it's a type of message which allows for the particular instance of the message to be for 2G or 3G or 4G related message instance to be sent. In practice, the output structure that these bits are marshaled into is not a union but a struct. So the different ones were one after the other. And the long story short is that what we could do is we could use sending one type and then corrupt from that into the other one and overwrite bits that also represent flags that are being used for the later code to decide which type actually was sent in to arrive to this situation where we are able to override the field that we wanted and then have it used. And then the final step was what I mentioned about, well, not everything is convenient because it's bits and 3 bits here, 5 bits there, 7 bits there. This was the last bit which, put up on a slide like this. It's like, and here you go, that's how you encode it, and it just worked. But really, actually, it was, again, quite a lot of puzzling to figure out a way where the bits just align. But again, the long story short is that with the right combination of message input, we were able to get to that outcome that we wanted, which is literally controlling all 4 of those bytes of that use bits field. That's all important in the end. And so you end up with a straight stack buffer overflow. And so at that point, you would say, you're mostly aware that depending on whether a stack buffer overflow is going to be trivially exploitable or difficult to exploit or maybe not exploitable at all, it's all going to be dependent on the mitigations on the platform. In prior art, and this is one point where we'll emphasize that this is why we thought that Kirin is a good target. In prior art, what was known is there was practically no mitigation, so no address space layout randomization, no stack cookies, these kind of things. But up to this point, what we used was a Kirin 970 family, so there are newer families than that, which was on Android 9 at the time. That was the newest at the time, so we knew that these bugs are 0 days. We knew that it's the most up-to-date present firmware of the device, but it still wasn't the newest generation of the device. So okay, on this we could see that, yeah, we can corrupt the stack, we can corrupt the stack pointer, whatever. So we got what we want, but we wanted to see, okay, let's get new devices from newer chipset families and see what happens there. And this is where we run into a wall. I'll pass it over to Lóránt for the second chapter.
So after the initial success of finding bugs in the modem firmwares of Kirin 970, we wanted to analyze the newer devices' modems. But we failed way before we can actually start the bug hunting. Huawei started to encrypt the modem images. They also discontinued the bootloader unroot possibility, so rooting as a feature was also out. As it later turned out, they also removed the modem debug facilities, and the kernel is now isolated from the modem, so it's not possible from the Android side to peek into the modem's memory. At this point, we were stuck. And this is when our research took an unexpected turn from pwning the basebands to pwning Huawei's secure boot. So based on older devices, we try to enumerate a firmware chain which finally leads to the modem loading. The modem loading is initiated by the kernel, but actually loaded by the TOS, the secure OS, which is loaded by the fastboot, and the fastboot is started by the exploitation. To our great relief, up until 990, the exploitation image is still preserved in plain text. So we could at least have something to analyze. But at the same time, we also realized that we didn't even know what are exploitators' responsibilities and where it's located in the boot chain. The boot process of Huawei Kirin begins with a power management controller detecting the power key. After that, Huawei phones have a quite unique way of boot up. The boot CPU is not one of the application CPUs like Cortex-A series, but a much more simple one, in this case, a Cortex-M3 microcontroller. In kernel sources, this core is referred as LPMCU, which probably stands for a low-power microcontroller. The boot ROM and the exploitation stages are initializing the SoC to make it prepared for the ACPU. The first image to run on the ACPU is fastboot, which has several duties during the bring-up process. It goes without even saying that every firmware loading process is cryptographically verified by the prepended certificate chain of the images. By 990, Huawei reduced the privilege level of the fastboot image from EL3 to EL1. So they introduced a new BL2 firmware image to offload the procedures that needs EL3 level. Still, regardless of the chip version, it's easy to see that by hijacking the exploitation stage, one could gain complete control of what code to run on the ACPUs. Next, we had to investigate the attack surface of the exploitation. Fortunately, we soon found out that there's an alternate boot path in which we have a chance to interact directly with the exploitation. This mode is called the USB download mode, and it can be triggered with a corrupted exploitation image, which is typically called a soft brick device, or via a test point. Test point is usually a tiny pad exposed on the backside of the PCB, as you can see on the slides. And the way to trigger is to pull it to ground. Actually, we found this info for a much older device on some online forums, so at first we weren't sure about whether it will work on our target or not, but luckily trial and error worked, and we didn't find it too difficult to find the location of the test point for newer devices. In fact, every Huawei device we've seen so far has this feature. We suspect this is because of factory flashing or repairability reasons. Of course, in this mode, the images, the downloaded images, are also cryptographically verified. So without a vulnerability, you are still stuck. So at this point, we fired up Ghidra and started to look for bugs. The plaintext image have a flat format, so it's not too difficult to load it correctly. First, we have to understand the protocol that is used for communication. In USB download mode, the phone enumerates as a serial over USB gadget. Over those serial lines, as it turns out, a slightly modified version of the X-modem, of the ages-old X-modem flight transfer protocol is used. To quickly summarize, the main building blocks of this protocol are the 4 different types of chunks, as we can see. Well, seems simple, right? As it turns out, still a lot could go wrong. Luckily, we ended up finding a bunch of exploitable vulnerabilities in the exploitation code. Better still, after successfully exploiting each of them, we were able to dump the boot ROM code. And not only did we find that some of these bugs also applies to the boot ROM, but we managed to find several that were boot ROM specific. Finally, although we started with 980, we were later able to verify that most of the bugs are also there and exploitable on the 990 series. Due to different memory maps, exploitation in exploitation and boot ROM were different. And also some of the bugs results in arbitrary memory write and others in sequential buffer overflows, so they needed different exploitation steps. Long story short, we managed to exploit each of these for full arbitrary code execution on the LPMCU and on the ACPU at EL3 level. Unfortunately, since we have limited time today, we are only going to discuss the first one in details. The first vulnerability is, which we call the head resend bug, was present in the bootrom code of at least Kirin 980 and 990. The XModem protocol is stateful because it must know when a data chunk arrives where to write it. There are many state variables in the implementation, but for the context of this bug, we should only know about the download address, the download size, and the next expected sequence counter. The first cause of this vulnerability is the fact that the address and the size states are always updated before the validation. The second cause is that there is no state reset when a validation decides that the head chunk just received is invalid. And the final third cause was that state checking only prevented data chunks being set without a valid head chunk, but did not prevent multiple head chunks being sent. So, as a result, we get a very strong arbitrary read-write primitive in 3 simple steps. First, send a head chunk with valid fields. This will set the next sequence counter to 1, which effectively allows downloading data chunks. Then send a head chunk again, but this time with a malicious address. This will update the address field, but leaves the next sequence counter intact. And finally, proceed downloading the data chunks and overwrite an arbitrary address with arbitrary data. Well, a pretty convenient bootrom exploit primitive, I would say. Equipped with this arbitrary write primitive, our next goal was to turn that into a code execution. Good news is that bootrom code does not use any kind of memory protection, so the whole SROM region is readable, writable, executable. But of course, overwriting existing bootrom code is not possible because of the read-only nature of the memory. What we can do is to overwrite a pushed return address on the stack. And even though we can't patch code, we don't even have to. The code we want to be executed can be downloaded in place of the Xloader image, because even if cryptographic verification fails, the data remains there intact. In practice, we also want to keep the communication channel alive to be able to communicate with our injected payload. And eventually, we would want to continue the boot process anyways. The most convenient way to achieve that is to start from the original Xloader code and patch only a small portion of the XModem protocol to inject our custom message handlers. Moving on to newer devices, the Xloader patching method fails because Huawei started to encrypt the Xloader images from 990. However, we were quite happy to see that the previous head reset bug still worked on 990. Nonetheless, this left us in dark because there is no plaintext bootrom or Xloader code to be analyzed or patched. So we wrote a fully black box exploit. Based on the bootrom code of 980, we created some heuristics to autonomously find and patch the XModem protocol handler, which is the foundation of the communication channel. Downloading data from host to the device is supported by the design of the XModem file transfer protocol, but thanks to a Huawei-specific extension, the inquiry chunk, it is possible to upload some data. This opened up a possibility for a very primitive dump payload, which we can use to retrieve the bootrom code or the plaintext Xloader code. The dumping was painfully slow. At 4 bytes per second, it took nearly 7 hours to dump the bootrom code. There were some minor issues with dumping the plaintext Xloader because manually invoking the decryption function resulted in a crash. The reason is still unknown. Nonetheless, we know the decryption works because the phone does power on, so we simply left the original code path to do the Xloader decryption. And right before the execution would have handed over to the Xloader code, we set a breakpoint and hijacked the control flow. The break reception ended up in our debug handler, from where we were able to dump the plaintext Xloader. well, in about 15 hours. In this demo, we are going to show you how we downloaded a patched Xloader and achieved arbitrary code execution in the ACPU as a modified fastboot image. So we start from a turn-off device because this test point is only detected at power on. There's a push button soldered onto the test point pins. This is for ease of development. When I plug in the USB, it triggers a turn-in signal, so the phone also enumerated as a USB over a serial over USB gadget. Now, the modified Xloader downloaded, which of course fails the verification, so the device re-enumerates. Then our arbitrary write used to jump onto the patched Xloader. And then now the patched fastboot code is downloading with a friendly little message on the boot splash screen, as we are going to see right now. So we have full code execution on the ACPU at EL3 level. We can take that into two directions. First, dump the fuses or read-write the raw flash storage. Up until 970, we were able to directly dump the AES key and decrypt the firmwares offline. But from 980, keys can be retrieved directly. But we can use the crypto engine as a decryption oracle. Images aren't coupled to a single device, so we can decrypt any image from any OTE for a particular keyring type, a chipset type. Second, we can continue up to the chain and patching out always the relevant cryptographic checks until we end up, for example, with a rooted kernel. In practice, there were a number of gotchas involving in this process, but the bottom line is we ended up seemingly successfully loading a modified modem image. And then it crashed, like almost all the time. Not exactly all the time, and not in ways which made sense to us, more in ways that started to make us question everything we thought we knew about ARM assembly. So it was a time to go back to modem reversing and try to figure out how modem OS has changed since the Kirin 970 days. This part actually took quite a bit again. First of all, we ended up building ourselves a debugger to test things dynamically. With this, we were able to map out how exploit hardening has changed. As you can see from the table, Huawei has been quite busy improving the modem security, which is nice. I want to point out specifically the ASLR feature. The employed Cortex-R8 processors has no MMU, so this ASLR is implemented as a pure physical address shift, which provides roughly 14 bits of entropy. However, baseband images are still distributed as flat format, so they are not compiled to be position independent. We were dumbfounded about how ASLR at all possible. Eventually, we figured out that Huawei included a relocation table into the flat image, and the modem loading process involves a relinking stage, which rewrites every single hard-coded value in the binary. So now it's clear what our problem was. Whenever we patched code, the relinking sometimes rewrote our instructions. To solve this, we had to reverse engineer and patch some functionality in the trust zone which enabled the ASLR, and then we modified the relocation tables not to interfere with our payload. With this, at last, we had a fairly robust debugging environment to consider further baseband research.
All right, so in the final chapter, we're going to talk about how we then looked at how we could expand these original exploit primitives and eventually even go beyond the baseband to get complete platform control. So here before I'm going to talk about very briefly, as we are short on time, although we were graciously given an extra 5 minutes, so I don't have to do it in 50 seconds. Before I talk about some of the bugs that we found for exactly that outcome, I want to take a brief moment to point out two things. One is that all the work we have done, we've worked with Huawei throughout the process, so the bugs that we have found, we have shared with them through coordinated disclosure, and to their credit, they moved quickly in each cases on fixing the bugs. And this is the part where I want to clarify that even though the presentation might feel very condensed and quick, in real time, of course, this is not how long it took us, not by a long shot. I mean, we are summarizing here somewhere over a year of work, and accordingly, the time that we spent, and also the talk is linear in the same way as the work was. So after the time that we spent on the remote bugs, then we spend the time on the bootloader bugs, exactly like Lóránt explained, and only after that on the Sandbox escape stuff. And of course, in between, as I've said, these bugs, the remote ones, have been submitted and of course fixed. So in that sense, the chain that we have completed hasn't been completed all at the same time, of course. So by the time we worked on these, the remote bugs were fixed per se. But still, what we wanted to see was, okay, given all the revelations about the mitigations and these things, could you still use the type of primitives that we have identified and complete something based on them? And here you could look at it different ways. Previously, I've mentioned that the type of bugs we have found were out-of-bound writes, a stack buffer overflow, or a heap buffer overflow. As you have seen, once they have stack cookies, the stack buffer overflow, for example, becomes less useful. For example, for the heap buffer overflow, there's a white paper also about this research which talks in lengthy detail about how, with the particulars of Huawei's basebands heap implementation, you can take a heap overflow and twist that into an arbitrary write primitive. The long story short is that, okay, we would have had primitives to do an arbitrary write, but then you would still have to worry about, well, there's ASLR, there's NX, and there's different ways to look at that, as you can sort of see on these silly graphs. You could do it one step at a time and say, okay, I have an arbitrary write for the baseband. Now I need a memory leak to complete that into baseband RC. Then I need an info leak from the Android side. Then I need an RC bug from the Android side. Then complete that into a kernel code execution. Then I need to start worrying about all the Huawei specific hardenings inside the kernel, and also the non-Huawei specific ones like SE Linux to then do more exploitation to get to an actual root process. And then if you want platform control, then you can start all over again and think about finding, again, info leaks and RC bugs and all that within their trust zone platform and all of that. But at the other end of that spectrum would be the idea, and that's the challenge that we had for ourselves. Okay, how about instead none of that? Can we find bugs which are particular to the platform that allow us to take a single arbitrary write and in one step get around all of that and get to complete platform control and not have to separate one at a time, worry about ASLR here or ASLR there or this PE or that sandbox. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of bugs like this that we managed to find. First, just a primer on how you can start thinking about escaping a baseband sandbox and what are the different interfaces that it has. First of all, the obvious one is that, of course, it will have like a direct IPC mechanism to talk to the Android side, of course, to send over the messages and all that comes from over the air and the other way around. But then the other part is DMA-capable peripherals that come in. Of course, when you start thinking about the pretty immense speeds that you already have to do in 4G, when you're thinking about 4 megabits per second, things like this, of course, you will need dedicated data movers to really get those packets going. And of course, as you will see, DMA-capable peripherals are often good friends of security researchers. But then there are additional things that you could think about. First of all, you can realize, and most importantly, that's where we looked at that, these chips these days, they are called SOCs, which stands for System on a Chip. And they're called that specifically because it's actually a really convoluted network of cores these days that comprise a modern smartphone like this. You do not only have the processor where the baseband runs that we talked about, and of course the processor where the Android side runs, but you have a maze of other hardware elements and other companion cores. So when you think about Sandbox escapes, you can think about lateral movement to one of the other cores, or even try and figure out on the bus level the DDR fabric of how that works and find or look for ways to attack that directly. So first we looked at traditional things. We really don't have time to go into these. If you're interested, you can check the white paper. We found a bunch of bugs here, but they come with the drawback of, okay, yeah, well, do you want to do blind remote kernel exploitation? You know, I don't. So moving on, then we looked at exactly the direct memory access capabilities that are available from the modem. Of course, here you can go two ways about it. You can be Huawei, and then you have your data sheets, and then it can be a more convenient process of like, okay, what's in the sock? Or you can be not Huawei, and then you don't have any of that. What you do have, however, is obviously the open source Linux kernel. And this is where we again and again and again were able to go to that well as a source of information and find various header files that give you hints. And then once you combine that with the ability that through the secure boot access that we have created for ourselves and the modem debugging capability that we have, you can start doing some dynamic probing and basically between those two things figure out how these Huawei specific originally black box DMA devices can actually be programmed. And then once you're there, you identify some DMAs on some GPIO addresses, and then you can basically give it a try. And this is kind of where, this was funnier, 6 months ago or whatever, but imagine that it's June and it's a super relevant joke. This is the point where we've kind of become a Euro meme, because we tried one of the DMA engines, just basically, okay, this is how you program this DMA engine. Well, let's see if we can, from the baseband, give it issue it transactions, can it override secure world memory or what have you. And then you tried it with the one and it didn't work at all, which is to say it looked restricted enough. And then we tried it with another one that the modem also accesses, which, and this is where lateral cores come in, that's a DMA engine which is not there for the modem to use it or leverage it to talk to the Android, but it's there for it to be able to talk to another core. But nonetheless, the most important part was that it was A, able to control it, and B, actually use it to issue transactions that could override secure world memory. And so that's actually a really awesome primitive, because not only you go past everything and now you don't have to worry about leaks or any of that. You can directly override trust zone code, and obviously from there you control the platform. But even the modem ASLR you don't have to worry about, because remember that these devices are usually controlled through some GPIO addresses which are going to be fixed between device firmware updates, and obviously agnostic completely to the ASLR itself, which is, again, like Laura mentioned, it's a physical shift, but that applies to the code and the data regions, not these register map outs. And so what you end up with is exactly what you wanted. All you need is that arbitrary write. With that single primitive, you can directly over the air program up the DMA engine and straight up inject whatever shellcode you want into trust zone. So that's like awesome if you want the CVE, but we didn't understand why this worked at all, whereas the other DMA engine didn't work. And so that was the final thing that we looked at. Again, going back to the kernel sources, and then combining what we find, particularly you get hints about particular hardware, physical addresses, and then you start looking at the trust zone code, where you imagine, well, this type of stuff is probably programmed through trust zone. Now we have hints of addresses that you can look for references to, and then start to understand the logic. And the long story short is that we were able to reverse engineer to a reasonable degree something that Huawei calls DMSS, probably direct memory subsystem. I don't know what it would abbreviate, but I know what it does. It's basically their memory firewall for DDR memory. It has entries that they call ASI entries, which are like PT entries in a page table, and each of these entries commands how a particular core within the entire SOC can access a particular range of memory. The problem with that entire concept was that like I've said, this is a system which is meant to control accesses to DDR memory. The problem was that these entries themselves are, where they are in the memory map, is actually not part of the DDR memory, which means that none of the rules which are there to control who can access what part of the DDR memory apply to it. And of course, you get the whole picture that the end result is that the modem was actually able to just directly raw access and reprogram these ASI entries. And that way what you ended up with is, again, fixed address, known contents, and with the single arbitrary write primitive, it's like directly overriding the page table in an old Linux kernel exploitation scenario. So you straight up override the ASI entries again over the air, and now you have become the master of like what core is supposed to be accessing what. And of course, at that point, you can open up the platform however you like from the modem's perspective. To finish things off, here's a quick demo. The reason you see, I guess everything, I mean, it's a presentation, so did it start? I never know when I push enough spaces. Okay, now it started. You can see the reason you see this typing with the digits is, like I've mentioned earlier, by the time we finished these Sandbox escapes, the remote bugs were fixed. So here, the part of let's inject code into the modem is simulated, and then we run the Sandbox part, the Sandbox escape part, which, as you see, ends up being able to control arbitrarily Linux memory, and in this case, we end up with a connect back root shell. And so that would be where we conclude the presentation. Thank you for also your patience with running a bit over time. And with that, if you have any questions, we would love to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks to Dániel and to Lóránt. We have time for a quick question or two, if there are any. There aren't any online questions at the moment, so we have one up there. Just
oh, questions, nice. Hello, Gabor. Oh, this is not even in the play.
So, thanks a lot for this great presentation.
Cheers.
So, I'm just curious, so how much time did you invest to find all these things? And so could you elaborate the process of this investigation? Thanks a lot.
Sure. It's easier for me to answer in real time. So calendar-wise, about a year, I want to say. A bit over a year. In terms of, it's obviously, it's not the only thing we do, so it's a little bit difficult to characterize correctly how much of our timetable was spent on this, but in terms of the total time where we continuously focused on this research was a bit over a year. And then within that, the original part, the baseband part was, I want to say, like 2 months or so. And then we spent significant amount of time in the bootloader part, quite a lot. And I really want to emphasize that not just the bug finding part, but some of the things that here seem like, oh, and then Lóránt finds the test point. Oh, and then we soldered on that thing and all that. I mean, that actually, a lot of that was the big time sinks. I mean, like the thing about figuring out this modem ASLR, I mean, there was like more than a week of like three of us banging our heads against the wall and every day getting more annoyed with like, this is impossible. So some of it is, sometimes some things you get stuck on. And obviously, yeah, the parts that are development, so like here we had no time to talk about it, but there were quite a lot of things about actually getting a reasonably working debugger for a modem that has its own challenges, and that took quite a while. And then the LPE part, so the Sandbox escape part, that was in bits and pieces, and also that's still ongoing research. So that's been sort of past the things that have been presented here. We've been continuing with that. Yeah. I don't know. I hope that answers that. Yeah.
Thank you, Dániel. Anybody else? Okay. In which case, again, thank you, Dániel, Lóránt, for your presentation.